It was lust that first got me into architecture. I was 20 and I was about to commence a postgraduate degree in art history. And at the time, I was infatuated with an architectural draftsman who was studying to be an architect. And you know how it is. When you're smitten with someone, you make a deliberate effort to cultivate their interests as your own. At least you do when you're 20. Anyway, that infatuation eventually waned. But I'm forever grateful for the fleeting agony of that unrequited love, that unrequited passion, because it left me with a lifelong love for architecture. And in that first class, I learnt about a really important figure in arts and crafts architecture, William Morris, a poet, designer, reformer. Morris believed that architecture was the mother of the arts, and he believed that art should be for all. He said, "I do not want art for a few, any more than I want education for a few, or freedom for a few." That idea that art should be accessible struck me as important. What would it take to make art part of everyone's daily life, not rarefied and separate from life, but embedded in life? It wasn't a huge leap to realise that the art that was accessible, the art that was embedded in life, was architecture. This product of human labour and culture that's necessary for brute survival could also be an art. And by art, I mean something that acts on and transforms us as individuals, as a society, something that is both an aesthetic experience, but also contains ideas about the world and about ourselves. And this was the path by which I came to see architecture as the most accessible and therefore the most democratic of the arts. Okay, so very few of us are ever going to own or commission a notable work of architecture. But unlike original works of art, which you have to go to a museum or an art gallery to see, you can encounter the everyday art of architecture by simply living. And it's the whole architectural setting of life that matters. It's not just the summit of Starchitect-designed iconic buildings or the peak of the world's most significant monuments. It's the foothills of pleasure to be found in our own cities. This was Mountfit's Canterbury Provincial Council chamber. It was built in 1865, and you can see that it has this quite serious, weighty exterior. Like most stone buildings, it's somewhat sombre. Its Gothic Revival style reminds us that when this place was settled, it was conceived by those European settlers as an ideal Anglican settlement. It was a settlement that placed a great deal of value on democratic governance. But do you know the interior? Or what was the interior? This glorious explosion of colour and pattern, this polychromatic splendour. What I still love about this building is that it says so much about our Victorian ancestors, that they balanced strong values with wild, glorious interior passions of the soul. If you walk down the street, you'll see the equivalent building today. This is our Civic building, which in 2010, Athfield Architects designed, and they took what was the postal centre, the distribution for mail all over the South Island, and they turned it into the Civic building, where our city council is. And before you even cross the threshold, you can receive ideas about 21st century values, about biculturalism, about a new kind of partnership for this city at this time. But because of its adaptive reuse, you can also read another really vital value for the 21st century, that of sustainability, and the idea, the fact, that the greenest building is the one already standing. Especially if you cover its north facade in layers of glass, and then you can use sophisticated mechanisms for heating and cooling a whole building with very low energy use. Now, these two examples bring into sharp relief another undeniable fact about architecture, and that's its political dimension. More than any other art, architecture is entwined in the political processes of society and linked to the expression of political power. And surely we in Christchurch know that better than we ever have before. This is Luck City, conceived and led by Uwe Rieger of Studio Christchurch as the opening night for the inaugural Festival of Transitional Architecture last year. It was 20 months after the 22nd of February earthquake, and the demolition of 80% of our inner city was over halfway through. And in response to the darkness and the emptiness, students created these beautiful installations. They were ephemeral, wildly creative, and experimental. In nature, they dealt with architectural issues of texture and opacity and dramatic formal gestures. And they explored architecture as an interactive art. This was architecture as an accessible public art, all right. But because 30,000 people turned out in one night, it became a political statement. A statement that a beautiful and engaging shared urban space is of immeasurable social and public worth. This is a hint of what's to come. A week tonight, Canterbury Tales, conceived and led by Free Theatre Christchurch as our major event for Festa 2013. It takes the integrated sites with student designs and performers and businesses, but it adds to it this heaving procession of enormous puppets and masked performers. And on one hand, it's a carnival of light and colour and movement that puts people back in the centre of the city. But on the other, for me, it's a reminder that the full enjoyment of architecture and civic space is not so much contemplating a work of art as attending a performance in which one is simultaneously a spectator and a participant, i.e. it's about architecture as an entwining of art and life. This performance of architecture provokes a question. How can we sustain architecture as a public and accessible art in a place which has been so disrupted and faces such a huge task? Well, will you find answers at Canterbury Tales? That's kind of up to you to discover and for us all to discuss. And I think we need to make a concerted effort to hold this public discussion, to sustain architecture as a public art. Because currently, our culture primarily values buildings and the urban environment for their economic worth as property, for their capacity to stimulate economic growth. But historical, contemporary, transitional, don't these shout that we can ask more from our urban environment than a crude shelter for brute economic survival? How do we get better at this? Well, how about starting by having a public discussion on architecture more than once a year? This is the Christchurch Centre for Architecture, and it doesn't have an architectural presence. It doesn't even have a legal status. It's a Facebook page and an email list and a series of events talks by local and visiting architects. What if we had a purposeful space to hold this really important conversation, to learn and talk about architecture, to challenge received architectural ideas and urban values? This is a critical time, which means that you don't need a charming young man to stimulate your lifelong love for architecture as a public art. Thank you.